Émilie du Châtelet's contribution to the epistemology of scientific explanation in the context of modernity has been recognized by scholars, and as an example is this workshop here organized by Clara and these different approaches. So scholars have finally realized that her methodology of hypothesis, which occupies a central role in the structure of the institution, is essential for understanding not only the argument of the work, but also for comprehending her influence and originality as a thinker of science. Du Châtelet not only advocated for the use of hypotheses, but she also developed the methodology of hypotheses in chapter 4 of the institution, and among other places. I'll approach Du Châtelet theory of hypothesis with this perspective of interpreting her theory of hypothesis as a form of nuanced or moderate experimentalism, which can be evidenced by her treatment of hypothesis in chapter 4 of the institution. And her perspectives can be compared to Rouault's approach to experiments and hypotheses within his Cartesian influence systems of natural philosophy. Examining the treatment of hypotheses in her institution alongside with the treatment of conjectures in Rouault's traité provides an interesting perspective on the contexts and influences shaping Du Châtelet's project in the institution. Her work can be seen as an attempt to bridge the debate between Cartesians, considered as speculative thinkers, and Newtonians, considered experimental thinkers. Elements of her nuanced approach are already present, though in less detail, in Rouault's work. That's what I'll try to show here today. This connection highlights the influence of the Cartesian tradition of natural philosophy from the late 17th and early 18th centuries on Du Châtelet's methodology, an aspect that has been overlooked by scholars that studied her contributions. The context for development of the Institution de Physique. Between Descartes' death in 1650 and the establishment of Newtonianism as the model of natural philosophy in France in the mid of 18th century, an intense debate on the methodology for the descriptions and explanations of natural events took place. This intense debate doesn't only present both sides as antagonists, but also presents as a mutual influence. Du Châtelet is clearly aware of this debate, as we know, in this quotation from the Avant-propos, section 6, when she defends that the world is divided between Descartes and Newton, and this division, it's not that interesting insofar as the best way to approach the subject. So Du Châtelet recognizes this division, this intense debate, but also has to approach to overcome this debate by developing perhaps a third alternative. So in this debate, the mutual influence, the world of thought, was contested by Cartesians, but also shared by them. The debate occurred not only in the tone of dispute, but also exchange of positions and mutual influence. So if you look at these authors from this period, from 1660 until 1720s in France, we can see different grades of positioning between these two perhaps poles of rendering hypothesis and the role of hypothesis and epistemology of science. Du Châtelet aims to bridge the gap created by the discussions and and adapted to the most up-to-date results in physics, which can be said about Newtonian perspective around the laws of attraction. She says that explicitly in the avant-propos, that one of her intentions in this work is to overcome this now outdated text written by Rouault, published in French for the first time in 1670. But my question here is, what really she means by overcoming Rouault? Does she overcome Rouault just by accepting a theory of attraction, the rules of attraction from Newton perspective, or there's something different there? So my proposal was to compare the methodology of the first chapters of the institution with also the methodology that we can find on the Traité. So I think that a more detailed study of the dialogue between Cartesians and Newtonians at the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century can illuminate the structure and aim of Du Châtelet, as well as bring more clarity to the complex developments of Cartesianism in early 18th century France. What was the role of Cartesian philosophy in the introduction, acceptance, and dissemination of experimental practices and methodologies in natural philosophy in the late 17th and early 18th centuries? Although the received vision or perspective of Descartes and Cartesianism classified that as excessive speculative philosophy or philosophers, we are able to see in a different degrees that are experiments done by Cartesians. And one of the most influential, if not the most influential Cartesians of this period of the late 17th century is Jacques Rouault, which was a strong defender of experimentalism. Of the 4 parts of the Traité de Physique, first part is more reflections about methodology and the role of metaphysics, or in a version of Cartesian metaphysics, but the other 3 parts are experiments and applications of what he calls conjectures. So Du Châtelet also seems to classify not only the problem is Descartes itself as a thinker, but the followers of Descartes as excessive or much speculative thinkers. And also she criticized Newton or Newtonians for banning hypotheses of the framework of science, developing a more balanced and what I called here the first moderate form of experimentalism. My point is that this moderate form of experimentalism is already to be found on Rouault's Traité. We should accept hypotheses, but this acceptance is not to be unruled. It has to be ruled and developed between some kind of strong and very well established methodology of hypothesis, which she's doing on chapter 4. But not only Rouault's Traité, it's of importance here. It's really important for us to look at the Clarke's translated and annotated version of Rouault's Traité. Well, first of all, because we have evidence that Du Châtelet had access to Rouault through Clarke's version of it. And she says that on a letter to her editor in 1739, around the period of development of the institution. So in this version of Rouault, it's really influenced, right? It first appears, so the original French version is from 1671. Many translations in many languages followed, and Clarke's editions at first in Latin appeared in 1702, then 1710 with more mathematical notes by Charles Morgan, the final version of comments by Samuel Clarke comes around 1723. And then between 1729 and 1735, many English versions that was done by Samuel Clarke's brother, John Clarke. One of my questions here is why Samuel Clarke persists in publishing a Cartesian physics textbook? Well, my hypothesis for that's that both shared the same methodological focus on experiment. Why not to produce only a fully Newtonian version? Well, it can be said also that Clarke's using Rouault to present an objection and a destruction of a Cartesian physics, and using that as an example how to Newton its better approach to physics than Descartes. Also, Clarke's mentions Rouault Traité as a version that, even though it's based on wrong premises, it can deliver some truth. The wrong premises that Clarke's mentioned here, it's mostly Descartes, and in this case, Rouault, theory of matter, only comprehended as a substance only around the notion of extension. But for the first part of Rouault's Traité, even in the commented sections, there is no notes around Rouault's methodology. Where when Rouault is defining conjectures, when Rouault is presenting the way that we should do physics or natural philosophy, Clarke has nothing to say there. I found that very interesting. And this is the version, as far as we know, that du Châtelet read Rouault, at least on the period of developing the final versions of the printed editions. So go to a little bit for the comparison between those two aspects now. In chapter 4, section 56, we find a definition of hypothesis when certain things are used to explain what has been observed, and though the truth, what has been supposed, is impossible to demonstrate, one is making a hypothesis. Thus, philosophers frame hypotheses to explain the phenomena, the cause of which cannot be discovered either by experiment or by demonstration. Hypotheses for du Châtelet arise in the domain of what cannot be mathematically demonstrated or observed solely through experiments. The hypothesis serves an explanatory function to point out the cause, even if it is not demonstrated as the true cause of the phenomena, that is, to provide the reason for the observed effects in the world. The empirical connection with the world is both the starting point and the end point of hypothesis. It's from observation that the phenomenon to be explained is identified, and after the formation of a hypothesis, whether for a particular explanation or a general theory, it must be compared with experience to judge its relevance. So already in du Châtelet, the definition of hypothesis, we found this approach of eclecticism between the roles and the necessity of empirical delimitation as a major part of her structuring of hypothesis. Combines need for guiding principles that are related to reason. That's also appeared in the last talk of Peter Einstein before mine, and the relation with empirical connection. So this hypothesis must be compared with experience to judge its relevance. Also, in the Vac-Pompot, section 8, we find the claim of the need, the necessity of hypotheses. And also this builds around the notion of scaffolding, and which in today's Andrea Reichenberger talk, it appears the explanation of this concept. In the next section, also in the meta form of the cane, the use of the cane and the blind, also the combination of this reason and experience as a fundamental aspect of her theory of hypothesis. And now, through the middle of chapter 4, another aspect which is regards the relation between experiments and hypotheses, the need of deducing from hypotheses everything that's possible and can be compared with the experiments. So I quote to Châtelet, "Thus in making hypotheses, one must deduce all the consequences that can legitimately be deduced and next compare them with experiments. For should all these consequences be confirmed by experiments, the probability would be greatest. But if there is a single one contrary to them, either the entire hypothesis must be rejected, if these consequences follow from the entire hypothesis, or that part of the hypothesis from which necessarily follows. Not only the combination and the deduction from hypothesis, also that the empirical checking and confirmation can be used favorably or against the maintaining of a hypothesis." Okay, so this is a very broad perspective on some aspects of the Châtelet theories of hypothesis. And now I want to compare this with Jacques Rouault's approach. So in Rouault also we find the integration of reasoning and experimentation. He combines mechanical explanations, reasoning, and experimentation. He rejects this categorical division of that we undo in science, so we either just use reason or just use experience. So reason articulates and deduces from observed data. Experience provides new discoveries and confirms theoretical structures. These combinations of reason and experimentation is the appropriate methodology for science. Now, quoting Rouault on Clarke's version in English that appeared in 1723. "Against the extremes." This is the preface, author's preface, without pagination in this edition. "A third defect which I have found in the method of philosophers is that some of them are wholly for reasoning and depend so much upon the strength of the arguments, especially if they borrowed from the ancients, that they judge it superfluous to make any experiments. Others, on the contrary, quite tired with such tedious arguments, the greatest part of which are not conclusive or are nothing to the purpose, think everything ought to be reduced to experiment, and that there should be no reasoning at all. But both these extremes hinder the progress of natural philosophy." Also, now for the combination, not only the mistake, but not directly defending that. "For they who fall into the first of these errors, hinder themselves of the best means of finding new discoveries, and of confirming their own arguments likewise. And they who fall into the second, by depriving themselves of the liberty of drawing conclusions, hinder the knowledge of a large train of truths, which may many times be deduced from one single experiment." Also, Rouault here, it's affirming that we have this ability of deducing facts about the world from the relations of hypothesis, reason, and experience. Wherefore, it cannot be very advantageous to mix experiments and arguments together. So now, for a little bit, that's a long argument in the preface of the Rouault Traité of dealing as a methodology. So the preface continuing in the first 3 chapters of it. So here another quote. "Lastly, the third sort of experiments are those which are made in consequence of some reasoning in order to discover whether it was just or not, as when after having considered the ordinary effects of any particular subject, and formed a true idea of the nature of it, that is, of that in it makes it capable of producing those effects, are also on the occasion of making the first conjectures concerning the nature of those subjects which natural philosophers are conversant about, and preserve them from some false notions they might otherwise perhaps have entertained. So the conjectures, the mix between experience and reasoning is the best way of understanding the capability of effects that can be produced and bring about in the world. In Rouault's definition of conjecture, we can see him developing an idea of a theoretical scenario based on instruments and experimentation. It aims to explain physical phenomena through mechanical causes, the integration of reasoning experimentation. And one of the characteristics of conjecture is the pursuit of a coherent and simple explanations subjected to empirical texts. Also, conjectures should provide a causal explanation of phenomena, even though if this is provisional. And this is a line of this science of hypothesis. To bring about one example, we could look in chapter 12, where Rouault is developing at least 3 conjectures to show that impossibility of vacuum in nature, and through the instrument of using a syringe and different kinds of liquids. Both Rouault and du Châtelet also said that this combination through reasoning and experiments, through hypotheses or conjectures, provide probable knowledge. Reason and experience alone are not sufficient for infallible knowledge. Forming hypotheses confirmed by experiments produces probable knowledge. This is a point of contact between du Châtelet and Rouault. So the first section of chapter 4 on the hypothesis, du Châtelet says precisely that. The true causes of natural effects and of the phenomena we observe are often so far from the principles on which we can rely and the experiments we can make that one is obliged to be content with probable reasons to explain them. Thus, probabilities are not to be rejected in the sciences, not only because they are often of great practical use, but also because they clear the path that leads to the truth. Rouault, now in chapter 3, when he's dealing with the proper manner of using philosophy to particular subjects, says that we must, for the most part, be content with probability. Thus, we must content ourselves, for the most part, to find out how things may be, without pretending to come to a certain knowledge and determination of what they really are. For there may be possibly different causes capable of producing the same effect, which have no means of explaining, At least, there are interesting convergences between du Châtelet's treatment of hypotheses and Rouault's treatment of conjectures. It doesn't seem to fit quite well with Rouault's perspective on conjectures, because some aspects of conceptualizing this hypothesis on du Châtelet and Rouault is quite in the same basis. So, as also du Châtelet spends part of her treatment of chapter 4 of developing a method of how to construct good hypotheses and how to avoid bad hypotheses, which in more detail, much more detailed version of Rouault do that. Also, you can find that on Rouault author's preface and the first chapters of the Traité de Physique. So in the last section of chapter 4, du Châtelet says, by distinguishing between the good and the bad use of hypotheses, both extremes are avoided. And without giving oneself up to fictions, a method very necessary to the art of invention is not denied to the sciences. A method that is the only means that can be used in difficult researches require correction over several centuries and the work of several men before attaining a certain perfection. Also, Rouault, in an intricate passage, comes to the conclusion that if you establish, when he's discussing, as an example, some hypotheses from the ancients around the notion of fire and the heat of fire, also points out that when you have a bad hypothesis, we are only come to conjectures as chimeras or fictions. So for du Châtelet, we can see that an emphasis between well-founded hypotheses and careless fictions as something to be avoided. Du Châtelet highlights the value of imagination as an epistemic force, but this has to do some restrictions and there's many rules of constructing hypotheses. Paganini's paper from 2022 has a good and interesting reconstruction of the process of developing a good hypothesis on chapter 4, for example. Also in Rouault, cautions against the projecting prejudice and unverifiable assumptions onto scientific phenomena. Science should refrain from attributing characteristics that cannot be empirically proven. This results in chimeras that hinder solid understanding. So coming to my conclusions here, we can see that if my approximation between du Châtelet and Rouault, which I only can sketch here at the moment, both of them are evading this distinction between Cartesianism and versus Newtonianism or radical experimentalism in the late 17th century France, or early Newtonianism on the early 18th century France. Both Institution and Traité exemplify methodological eclecticism. They reject abuse of untestable hypotheses or experiments without theoretical guidance. But they also are trying to balancing a scientific methodology between theoretical guidance and experimentation, such as synthesis of cognitive faculties for objects under investigation. The major influence that Rouault had on the last decades of the last decades of 17th century in France can also seem to last in the early 18th century, and he can see echoes of it on du Châtelet Institution. Of course, the Rouault ontology is a Cartesian ontology, and many aspects of it is not acceptable to du Châtelet. But her overcome of Rouault is not concerning an entirely reconstruction of hypothesis, seeing Rouault is not as excessive use of hypothesis. So Rouault is not one of this, at least Rouault is not one of the Cartesians pointed as one has abusing hypothesis in the institution. Thank you.